morning. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be in your midst this morning, and I would like to thank the organizers of this first International Congress of the Celso Furtado Center for International Development. I read the work of Celso Furtado for the first time in the mid-1960s when I was an undergraduate student in economics at the University of Delhi, thousands of miles away from Brazil. And I continued this as a graduate student at the University of Oxford in the late 1960s. It was the historical perspective on underdevelopment that I found most interesting. More than 3 decades later, in August 2000, I was invited to speak at a conference in Recife that was organized to honor Celso Furtado on his 80th birthday. And it provided me with an opportunity to meet him, which was very nice indeed. There has been much talk about the crisis, which is the theme of this conference. And indeed, this is the deepest crisis of capitalism in the world economy since the Great Recession of the 1930s. What is more, it coincides with what some observers describe as a triple crisis: the financial crisis, the food crisis, and the environmental crisis. But I want to say that it is not the end of history, nor the end of geography. There will be life after the crisis, and there will be a world economy that might unfold in different ways. Now, I'm going to speculate about what might happen, but I cannot say what will happen. I think Celso Furtado would have approved of the theme I have selected for my inaugural lecture, but whether he would have approved of the content of what I have to say is for you to judge at the end of the hour. The object of my lecture is to analyze the evolution of developing countries in the world economy, situated in its wider historical context. From the onset of the second millennium, but with a focus on the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. The structure of what I have to say is as follows. First, I will examine the changes in the economic importance of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, now described as the developing world, as compared with Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, and Japan, now described as the industrialized world, in a long-term historical perspective. This highlights the dominance of the former group of countries until about 200 years ago, to trace their decline and fall from 1820 to 1950. Second, I will consider the changes in the significance of developing countries in the world economy since 1950. This reveals an increase in the share of developing countries, not only in world population and world income, but also in international trade, international investment, industrial production, and manufactured exports, which gathered momentum from 1980. Third, I will analyze the factors underlying the apparent rise of developing countries in the world economy. In doing so, I will discuss catch-up in terms of economic growth and industrialization. Fourth, I will disaggregate the impressive performance of the developing world to argue that this rise is associated with unequal participation and uneven development. Indeed, there is a concentration in the process which excludes countries and people, so that economic growth has not been transformed into meaningful development that improves the well-being of ordinary people. Fifth, in conclusion, I will contemplate the future to suggest that the prospects of developing countries in the world economy, as also their ability to sustain this rise, depend upon their capacity to combine economic growth with human development and social progress. Let me begin with the long-term historical perspective. The division of the world into industrialized countries and developing countries is more recent than is widely believed. It does not go back far in time. A long-term historical perspective suggests a distinction between the period before the 19th century, when geography divided the world, and the period since the 19th century, when the world came to be divided by economics. The first period is one of dominance. Now, Table 1, which is based on estimates of population and income by Angus Madison, presents evidence on the distribution of population and income in the world economy in the years 1000, 1500, 1600, and 1700. The world, you will see, is divided in terms of geographical regions. The first group is made up of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, while the second group is made up of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, Oceania, and Japan. Focus simply on the group totals. At the end of the first millennium, in 1000, Asia, Africa, and Latin America together accounted for 82% of world population and 83% of world income. In fact, this overwhelming importance of the three continents continued in the second millennium for some time to come. Even 500 years ago, in 1500, they accounted for about 75% of both world population and world income. 2 centuries later, in 1700, their share in world population remained the same, about 3/4, but their share in world income, you would see, declined to 2/3. In this context, it is worth noting that such dominance was attributable in large part to just 2 countries. During the period from 1000 to 1700, China and India taken together accounted for 50% of world population and 50% of world income. It is no surprise that Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, Oceania, and Japan, even taken together, were far less important in the world economy. Their share in world population increased from less than 1/5 in 1000 to about 1/4 in 1500 and 1700. Over the same period, their share in world income rose from 1/6 in 1000 to 1/4 in 1500 and 1/3 in 1700. It would seem that the second half of the second millennium witnessed beginnings of change. This was in part attributable to the first phase of European colonial expansion in the late 15th century in the Caribbean and the Americas. It began with the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, followed by England and France. The slave trade from Africa, the search for gold and silver in the New World, the colonization of the Americas, the rise of Asian entrepot trade, where manufactured goods were exchanged for silver, were a part of this process which unleashed a somewhat different phase in the formation of the world economy from the early 16th to the late 18th century. It was the age of mercantilism in Europe. The share of Western Europe in world income, you would notice, registered a significant increase. This period also witnessed the beginnings of a division of labor between primary producers and manufacturers, but the organization of production was essentially pre-capitalist. It was the onset of the Industrial Revolution at the end of this era which introduced the possibilities of a structural transformation in the world economy. Let me now turn to the period of decline and fall, as it were. The 19th century witnessed the evolution of an international economic order, which led to a profound change in the balance of economic and political power in the world. The division of the world into rich industrialized countries and poor developing countries, to come much later, was an outcome of this process. It was attributable, put simply, to 3 developments. The first was the Industrial Revolution in Britain during the late 18th century, which spread to Western Europe slowly during the first half of the 19th century. The second was the emergence of a newer, somewhat different form of colonialism in the early 1800s, which culminated in the advent of imperialism that gathered momentum through the 19th century. The third was the revolution in transport and communication in the mid-19th century, manifest in the railway, the telegraph, and the steamship. These three developments, which overlapped and partly coincided in time, transformed the world economy by creating patterns of specialization in production associated with the division of labor through trade, through or reinforced by the politics of imperialism. There are competing explanations for this outcome. Some emphasize economic factors to argue that an industrial revolution was dependent on a prior or simultaneous agricultural revolution. Some emphasize political factors to argue that imperial powers did not allow industrialization in their colonies. Some emphasize a mix of economic and political factors to argue that the economics of colonialism and the politics of imperialism together created this international economic order. Now, it would mean too much of a digression for me to enter into a discussion of these competing explanations. Suffice it to say that the outcome was unambiguous. The world economy came to be divided into countries, mostly with temperate climates, that industrialized and exported manufactures, and countries, mostly with tropical climates, that did not industrialize and exported primary commodities. Slowly but surely, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America became dependent on the industrializing countries in Western Europe, not simply for markets and finance, but also as their engine of growth. The economic relationship between the two sets of countries was driven and reinforced by the political dominance of Europe. This led to deindustrialization and underdevelopment in what became the developing world, just as it led to industrialization and development in what became the industrialized world. Both outcomes were an integral part of the process of development of capitalism in the world economy. It is somewhat difficult to find a turning point in time for this division of the world economy. I think the process began around 1820, and its outcome was discernible by 1870, and the process continued until 1950. Now, this emerges clearly from Table 2, which presents evidence on the share of developing countries and industrialized countries in world population and world GDP for selected benchmark years during the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay. Focus on the period first between 1820 and 1950. I'll come to the period since 1950 a little later. Between 1820 and 1950, the share of developing countries in world population declined, you will see, from 3/4 to 2/3, but their share in world income witnessed a much more pronounced decline from 63% to 27%. Between 1820 and 1950, the share of industrialized countries, you will see, in world population rose from 1/4 to 1/3, while their share in world income almost doubled from 37% to 73%. This transformation of the world economy spanned just 130 years. But a new international economic order was already discernible at the end of 50 years. By 1870, the share of developing countries in world population had already decreased to 2/3, while that of industrialized countries had already increased to 1/3. And by 1870, the share of what we now call developing countries in world income had fallen to 43%, while that of industrialized countries had risen to 57%. For the world economy, the significance of 1870 is clear. The balance of power had shifted. The division of labor had changed. The beginning of a divide between industrialized countries and developing countries in the world economy was visible. It is no surprise that between 1820 and 1950, there was a sharp increase in the asymmetries between the two sets of countries in world population and world income. Please look at the left-hand side of the panel, which plots the share of the West and the rest in world population and world income, and you see that the share of the West in world's population is this dotted red line, its share in world GDP is the bold red line, and it is the reverse for what we now call the developing countries. Okay? It may, however, be misleading to consider developing countries as an aggregate. Some disaggregation is necessary because there were significant differences between different regions of the developing world. The increase in disproportionality was particularly pronounced in Asia. Between 1820 and 1950, Asia's share in world population diminished, you will see, from 65% to 51%, but its share in world income dropped from 56% to 15%. For Africa, the shares in world population and world income were relatively stable, although the latter was consistently lower. For Latin America, the shares in world population and income were symmetrical throughout the period 1820 to 1950. What is more, both shares rose over the period under consideration, a sharp contrast with Asia. And in 1950, please note that Latin America's share in world income was higher than its share in world population. So if you look at the story disaggregated, you see Asia on top. Its share in population declines, but its share in world income declines precipitously. For Africa, the share in world income is lower than the share in world population. And for Latin America, the two lines move so closely together that you can see no difference. The share in world income and world population rises. Now, it is clear that in this period, Latin America was the exception in the developing world. The explanation may not be obvious, but it is worth noting that during the 19th century, when countries in Asia and Africa were just beginning to be colonized, countries in Latin America were beginning to attain independence. This process of independence from colonial rule in Latin America started in 1810 and was consolidated by the 1820s. For this reason, perhaps, there was a slight increase rather than a decline in Latin America's share of world GDP between 1820 and 1870. The period thereafter witnessed the rise of Latin America as its share in world GDP more than trebled from 2.5% to 7.5% in 1950. Indeed, it would seem that Latin America was the success story of the developing world during the period from 1870 to 1950. In sharp contrast, Asia was the disaster story. The economic decline of Asia, which began in 1820, continued apace thereafter as its share in world GDP dropped from 36% in 1870 to 15% in 1950. Now, given the changes in shares in world population and world income, it is not surprising that the divergence in income per capita between developing countries and industrialized countries increased rapidly. Okay? This is confirmed by the evidence in Table 3. I describe, take Western Europe and Western offshoots, which is Madison's phrase for North America, the United States and Canada, and Oceania, Australia and New Zealand. You take them, their per capita income, GDP, at 100, and you will see that between 1820 and 1950, as a percentage of GDP per capita in Western Europe, North America, and Oceania taken together, GDP per capita in Latin America, despite its success, dropped from 3/5 to 2/5. In Africa, from 1/3 to 1/7, and in Asia, from 1/2 the level of Western Europe and Western offshoots to 1/10. Clearly, there was a widening of the gap in per capita incomes between the developing world and the industrialized world. This divergence was modest in Latin America, massive in Asia, and somewhere in the middle for Africa. The great divergence was not confined to developing countries alone. Let me just go back to this slide. It extended to Eastern Europe and Japan, as you saw. And it would seem that over these 130 years, Western Europe and North America pulled away from the rest of the world, leaving it behind. But at the same time, just as there was a great divergence between the West and the rest, there was a little divergence between Northwest Europe and South and East Europe. In sum, the evolution of the world economy during this era was shaped by two sets of factors. The first set, which exercised a strong influence over the period from 1820 to 1870, was made up of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which spread to Europe, the emergence of colonialism, which spread to Asia and Africa, and the revolution in transport and communication, which shrank the world as time and distance both collapsed. The second set, which exercised a strong influence in the period between 1870 and 1914, what Eric Hobsbawm describes as the Age of Empire, that was made up of the politics of imperialism and the economics of globalization, which created winners and losers. The influence of these factors possibly waned over the period from 1914 to 1950, interspersed as it was by two world wars and the Great Depression, but the inherent logic and the essential characteristics of industrial capitalism meant that uneven development for unequal partners persisted in the world economy. And that story came to its logical conclusion by 1950. Okay? That brings me to the second part of my lecture. For developing countries in the world economy, 1950 was perhaps the next turning point. It was the beginning of the post-colonial era as the newly independent countries in Asia and Africa sought to catch up in terms of industrialization and development. This is discernible, once again, if we go back to the Madison data on the share of different regions and groups in world population and world income. Let me go back to that for a minute. And you focus on the last four columns this time around, please. And you would see that during the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st, roughly two phases are discernible, 1950 to 1973 and 1973 to 2008. In the period from 1950 to 1973, the share of developing countries in world population rose from 67% to 72%, while their share in world income stopped declining for the first time in 130 years and rose modestly from 27 to 28%. There was a corresponding decline in the share of industrialized countries in world population and world income. Note that this was the golden age of capitalism, okay, associated with rapid economic growth in industrialized countries. But economic growth, you would see, was faster in developing countries. The share of Asia in world population rose more than its share in world income, so that the asymmetry persisted. The share of Africa in world population rose a little, while its share in world income fell a little. The share of America in world population and world income registered an increase, although these shares remained symmetrical. Okay? Now, the period from 1973 to 2008 is different, the age, as it were, of markets and globalization. The share of industrialized countries in world population dropped from 27% to 19%, but their share in world income, please note these are PPP estimates, and I'll come to estimates at market exchange rates a little later, dropped from 71, 72% to 50%. Okay? There was a corresponding increase in the share of developing countries, obviously, in world population and world income. Asia's share in world population increased from 55 to 57%, but its share in world income went from 16 to 38%. Africa's share in world population rose from 10% to 13%, but its share in world income remained at about 3.5%. Latin America's share in world population rose from 7.9 to 8.7%, but its share in world income fell from 8.7 to 7.9%. Just a mirror image. Now, you will see this story in Figure 2. If you look at what I now call the industrialized and developing countries, the successors of the West and the rest, you can see how in the period from 1950 to 73, the divergence stops, okay, in terms of shares in world income, and how 73 to 2008, their shares are almost equal in PPP terms, all right? And the story for Asia, share in world population, rising share in world income. Africa, share in world population, red, share in world income. And Latin America, once again, the two converging lines, one more or less hiding the other. During this period, and I'll cut a long story short, the divergence in per capita incomes vis-a-vis the West continued for Africa and Latin America. It continued from until 2001, but stopped thereafter in the 2000s. For Asia, the divergence continued until 1973, when it stopped and began to diminish slowly thereafter. Now, it would seem that Latin America was the exception in the developing world during the period from 1870 to 1950, and it continued to be an exception until 1973. Okay? It fell behind the industrialized world, but at a slower rate than Asia and Africa. However, Asia was the exception after 1950. Its economic decline stopped during the period from 1950 to 1973. You can see that. And its catch-up in the industrialized world accelerated in pace during the period from 1973 to 2008. Now, let me go back to this slide. So far, I've considered what happened to developing countries in the world economy since 1950 in terms of Madison data. But we have much more complete statistics on the world economy since 1950, and I will use those now to show you what happened to their share in population, output, trade, investment, industry, and manufactured exports. A perspective on changes in population during the second half of the 20th century also requires some reference to absolute magnitudes, not just shares. And you will see Table 4. It presents evidence on the share of developing countries in world population from 1950 to 2010. It shows that the size of the population in the developing world, made up of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, increased from 1.7 billion in 1950 to 3.4 billion in 1980 and 5.7 billion in 2010. This was attributable in large part to demographic factors, as death rates dropped, but birth rates did not. It also shows that the share of developing countries in world population increased from 2/3 in 1950 to 3/4 in 1980 and more than 4/5 in 2000. Now, this was attributable to rapid population growth in developing countries and the stable population in industrialized countries. And it would seem, if you want to compare with the past, that the share of developing countries in world population in 1980 returned to its level during the period from 1500 to 1820. And by 2010, this share had returned to its level in the year 1000 AD. Okay. Let me go to output and income. For an analysis of trends in GDP and GDP per capita since 1950, it is also necessary and appropriate to consider evidence at market exchange rates, rather than purchasing power parities. Computation of GDP per capita in terms of PPP may be helpful for international comparisons of relative standards of living. Okay? A barber in Mumbai with a barber in New York. But it's not quite correct to add up GDP in terms of PPP across countries because these estimates are based on an artificial upward adjustment in the price of non-traded goods and services in developing countries, which leads to an upward bias in the PPP GDP estimates for developing countries, which are thus not comparable with other macro variables such as foreign trade, international investment, or industrial production, all of which are valued at market prices, at market exchange rates. However, the use of Madison, which had more sophisticated PPP estimates of income, serves a purpose for the long term. Now, note that the share of developing countries in world GDP at current prices and at market exchange rates was 17% in 1970, 21% in 2000, and 31% in 2010. Of course, these trends are significantly influenced by differences in inflation rates and movements in exchange rates. In order to resolve the problem arising from different inflation rates, I have Table 5 here, which looks at GDP and GDP per capita in developing countries in the world economy at constant 2000 prices. It shows that at constant prices, GDP in developing countries as a proportion of world GDP increased from about 15% in 1970 to 25% in 2010. But the table tells a very different story about per capita income. Okay? It shows that GDP per capita in developing countries as a proportion of GDP per capita in industrialized countries remained almost unchanged in the range of 5% between 1970 and 2000. It rose to 6% in 2005 and 7.5% in 2010. Now, the focus on population and income, while instructive, is not sufficient. It is also necessary to consider the engagement of developing countries with the world economy through international trade and international investment. In addition, it is important to consider whether or not developing countries met with success in their quest to catch up in terms of industrialization. Now, let me look very quickly at each of these variables. International trade is perhaps the most important form of engagement with the world economy. Table 6 presents evidence on the share of developing countries in world trade. It shows that the share of developing countries in world exports, and I'll round off the figures in the table, increased from 14% in 1970 to 20% in 1990 to 30% in 2000 and 42% in 2010. The share of developing countries in world imports also increased, a little less, 14% in 1970, 19% in 1990, 27% in 2000, and 39% in 2010. Note that the significance of developing countries in world trade as sources of imports and markets for exports more than doubled between 1990 and 2010. Also interesting to note that in 1970, the share of developing countries in world exports and imports was roughly commensurate with their share of world GDP, but by 2010, their share in world exports and imports was much higher than their share in world GDP. A comparison with the past is also worthwhile. I won't bore you with the numbers, but the share of developing countries in world trade in 1970 was roughly where it was in 1870. But by 2010, that share was double what it was in 1913. Okay? Now, this slide is too crowded, but basically it tells you, puts out the evidence on foreign direct investment inward and outward, as also stocks and flows in developing countries, industrialized countries, and the world. Okay? Between 1990 and 2010, the share of developing countries in the inward stock of foreign direct investment in the world rose from about 1/4 to 1/3. Over the same period, the share of developing countries in inward flows of foreign direct investment was in the range of 1/3. Between the same years, 1990 and 2010, the share of developing countries in the outward stock of foreign direct investment in the world increased from about 1/14 to 1/7, and in flows of outward flows of foreign direct investment, it went up from about 1/10 to 1/6. Now, some comparisons with the past are interesting. In 1900, foreign investment in developing countries, direct and portfolio taken together, was the equivalent of about 1/3 the GDP of developing countries. And in 2000, foreign direct investment in developing countries was about 30% of the GDP of developing countries. Now, it would seem that for developing countries, the significance of foreign investment at the end of the 20th century was about the same as it was at the end of the 19th century, but with one important difference. In the 2000s, developing countries, as you see from here, became an increasingly significant source of foreign direct investment in the world economy as investors, and this is a new phenomenon. Okay? Now, let me turn to industrial production. It's difficult to find time series evidence on industrial production in developing countries and in the world economy since 1950, and the problems that arise from comparability of data over time. In this table, I've put together numbers at quinquennial intervals, so they highlight the change. I have time series evidence, 2 time series, with some overlap, which makes it possible to interpret the trends. And you will see that during the period, the 75 to 1990, the share of developing countries in world manufacturing value added and 1980 constant prices registered a modest increase from 12.5% to 15%. Okay? But during the period 1990 to 2010, the share of developing countries in world manufacturing value added at 2000 prices doubled from 16% to more than 32%. Okay? Now, I have the same numbers in 3-time series going up to 2007 in this slide, and you will see how their share in world manufacturing output rises from a level of less than 10% until 1980 to a level of about 30%. Now, some comparison with the past is instructive. The share of developing countries in world industrial output was 60.5% in 1830, but it dropped to 36% in 1860, 11% in 1900, and 7.5% in 1913. As Western Europe and North America industrialized, Asia in particular deindustrialized. And the share of developing countries in world industrial production stayed in the range of 7 to 8%, its 1913 level, until around 1970. Okay? Now, this catch-up in industrialization was reflected in the share of developing countries in manufactured exports. You would see it rises from less than 7% to 75 to 18% in 1990 to 36% plus in 2010. Okay? And I have a similar time series that goes only up to 2007, and you'll see how this share rises from about 5% to something like 38%. Okay? So that's the story of developing countries in the world economy since 1950. Okay? Now, what were the underlying factors in the period before 1950 and after 1950? So I'm going to tell you 2 short stories. The changes in the significance of any subset of countries in the world economy over time depend on their performance in terms of economic growth as compared with the rest of the world. Okay? Now, Table 10 presents evidence on growth rates in the world economy 1820 to 1950. And it explains all in a tautological sense. The progressive, indeed rapid decline in the relative importance of developing countries in the world economy over the period from 1820 to 1950 is easily explained in terms of slow growth in GDP as compared with Western Europe, North America, Eastern Europe, and Japan. The differences in the relative importance of regions within the developing world that surfaced over time can also be explained in difference of growth performance, whether it's the dramatic decline in the share of Asia, the relatively stable share of Africa, or the sharp increase in Latin America's share in world income. It shows up in GDP growth rates. The divergence or convergence in per capita income between groups of countries that emerged over time is also clearly reflected in differences in growth rates of GDP per capita. In the period from 1820 to 1950, there was a great divergence in per capita income between Western Europe and North America on the one hand and Asia on the other. But this divergence was much less for Latin America and somewhere in the middle for Africa. Now, even if it is tautological, the widening productivity gap between these 2 parts of the world was the essential underlying factor. There was sustained productivity growth and industrialization in Western Europe and a steady productivity decline and deindustrialization in Asia. The rise of Western Europe and the decline of Asia is something that is written about, needs some explanation, even if brief. Now, evidence available suggests that circa 1750, mid-18th century, life expectancy, consumption levels, and product markets in Western Europe and Asia were similar, and living standards of people were not far apart. What is more, at the time, the advanced regions of Europe and Asia were similar rather than different, with economies that were sophisticated. Now, it has been argued that the great divergence between Europe and Asia during the 19th century, Pomerantz, was attributable to the fortunate location of coal, which substituted for timber, and trade with the Americas, which allowed Western Europe to grow along resource-intensive and labor-saving paths, whereas Asia was stuck in the cul-de-sac of labor-intensive and resource-saving paths. Now, there's another more interesting hypothesis. Let me just go back to that slide, which suggests that during the 18th century, high wages combined with cheap capital and cheap energy in Britain, as compared with Asia, and also other countries in Europe, meant that technologies of the Industrial Revolution, whether the steam engine, the spinning jenny, or using coke rather than charcoal to smelt ore into iron and into steel, were profitable to invent and to use in Britain, while the substitution of coal for wood as a source of energy made an enormous difference. These arguments do not, indeed cannot, provide a complete explanation, for the basic causes, as I argue in my forthcoming book, were manifold and complex. The search for coal might have been driven by shortages of wood, which followed deforestation at home. The search for new technologies might have been driven by competition from Asian manufacturers, whether cotton textiles from India or porcelains and silks from China. In both Europe and Asia, events were shaped by the complex influence of economic, social, and political factors in a national context, but the global economy exercised an important influence. In particular, British military successes overseas, following those of Spain and Portugal, which were rather different in a qualitative sense, played a significant role, while the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Britain were closely related with international trade and overseas expansion. The economic growth in Britain was in important part also attributable to the organization of production in the capitalist system, based on the division of labor associated with capital accumulation and technical progress, which was strongly supported by state intervention. Countries in Western Europe followed a similar path a little later, but this did not happen in Asia. The process of industrialization in Britain and Northwest Europe led to an increase in the share of the manufacturing sector and a decrease in the share of the agricultural sector in output and employment. Over time, the outcome was a structural transformation in the composition of output and employment. International migration, which moved people from land-scarce Europe to land-abundant Americas, supported the process. The movement of labor from employment in agriculture to manufacturing, in turn, led to sustained increases in productivity. The process of industrialization was supported by state intervention through tariff protection and industrial policies in the United States, in France, in Germany. The access to resources from colonies in the Americas and elsewhere was just one part of the story. Now, for the period since 1950, Table 11 presents evidence on growth rates in GDP and GDP per capita for regions within the developing world, the developing countries, the industrialized countries, and the world economy during the periods 1951-80 and 81-2008. Okay? Now, the middle 1980 I use as a turning point, and statistical evidence suggests it was a turning point to do this periodization. Alas, we don't have UN data available for the period, national account statistics for the period before 1970. So what I did use Madison data and UN data for 81-2000, for which both sources are available. You will see they're very close to each other. So it allows me to make a comparison of growth rates in 1951-80 based on Madison data and 1981-2008 based on national account statistics for countries in the world. And you will see that the arrest of the decline in the relative importance of developing countries in the world economy during the period 51-80 is explained in terms of GDP growth rates. That was somewhat higher, you will see, than GDP growth rates in industrialized countries. And it would seem that economic growth in all regions of the developing world during the period 1951 to 80 was impressive and way ahead of what it was 1820 to 1950. The divergence within the developing world happens after 1980. The modest recovery in Asia's share of world income after 1980, followed by its rapid rise since 1980, was much attributable to much higher GDP growth than elsewhere in the world. Economic growth in Latin America during the period 1951-80 was also comparable with that in industrialized countries. So that its share in world income increased, but its growth performance was distinctly worse after 1980 You can see that, so that there was some decline in the share of world income. Similarly, Africa experienced a contraction in its share of world income, particularly after 1980, as GDP growth rates were lower than elsewhere in the world. Now, economic growth in the developing world during the second half of the 20th century was not associated with any meaningful convergence of per capita incomes as compared with the industrialized world. The divergence in per capita income, however you measure it, persisted. In fact, for Latin America and Africa, this divergence registered a significant increase after 1980. Asia was perhaps the exception, insofar as divergence stopped, and there was a modest beginning in terms of closing the income gap starting 1980, but it was not convergence except in a few, very few countries, as I will show. The share of developing countries in world manufacturing output doubled, as I said, from 16% to 32% in just 20 years, between 1990 and 2010. Now, in terms of simple arithmetic, this was attributable to the slowdown in industrial production in industrialized countries, but also to the acceleration of industrial growth in developing countries. Now, the latter outcome, I think, was attributable in important part to development strategies and economic policies in the post-colonial era, which created the initial conditions and laid the essential foundations in countries that were latecomers to industrialization. The much maligned import substitution-led strategies of industrialization made, I think, a critical contribution to this process of catch-up. Of course, complete explanations are more complex. All the same, note that the role of the state was critical in the process. Industrialization was not so much about getting prices right as it was about getting state intervention right. Indeed, even in the small East Asian countries, often cited as success stories, the visible hand of the state was much more in evidence than the invisible hand of the market. It would seem that the degree of openness and the nature of state intervention turned out to be strategic choices in the pursuit of industrialization, which were shaped by the stage of development to begin with, but changed as circumstances changed over time. Now, apart from an extensive role for governments in these domains, the use of borrowed technologies, an intense process of learning, the creation of managerial capabilities in individuals and technological capabilities in firms, the nurturing of entrepreneurs and firms in different types of business enterprises were the major factors underlying this catch-up in industrialization. The creation of initial conditions was followed by a period of learning to industrialize, so that outcomes in industrialization surfaced after a time lag. Clearly, it was not the magic of markets that produced this spurt in industrialization. Indeed, experience suggests that success in industrialization was about creating initial conditions in terms of education, infrastructure, capabilities, and institutions, managing strategic integration rather than opting for a passive insertion into the world economy, and recognizing the specificities of economies in time and space. Now, the share of developing countries in world manufactured exports also rose rapidly, as I said, 7% in 1975, 18% in 1990, 37% in 2010. Now, note that their share in world manufacturing value added was higher than their share in world manufactured exports until 1980. These two shares were roughly similar through the 80s. Beginning in the 1990s, however, the share of developing countries in world manufactured exports progressively exceeded their share in world manufacturing value added. It is plausible to suggest that there were two sets of factors underlying these trends, which were interconnected but sequential in time. First, for developing countries, external markets became increasingly important in the process of industrialization. It began with Brazil and Mexico and Latin America in the mid-60s, where rapid economic growth did not continue, alas, beyond the late 70s. But export expansion continued, indeed gathered momentum with the East Asian success stories: Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. The small Southeast Asian economies, Malaysia and Thailand, followed in their footsteps. And it was not long before China and India, the mega economies in Asia, also sought access to external markets. Second, as globalization gathered momentum in the late 20th century, there was a progressive integration of developing countries into the world economy, particularly through trade and international subcontracting. It began with transnational corporations from industrialized countries sourcing imports of labor-intensive manufactured goods from selected developing countries by relocating production or through subcontracting. In time, this provided opportunities for domestic firms from developing countries, which had created the initial conditions for industrialization to manufacture for world exports in collaboration with or in competition with transnational corporations. Okay? Now, it is important to recognize that aggregates for the developing world are deceptive. The observed increase in the share of developing countries in world output, international trade, manufacturing, production during the second half of the 20th century may create a false impression of widespread development. This is misleading. Much of the catch-up is in a few developing countries. China, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand in Asia, to which I would now add Taiwan and Turkey, although the numbers are not here. Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico in Latin America, to which I would add Chile, and South Africa in Africa, to which I would add Egypt or Nigeria, or both. Now, this group of 12 countries, without the additions, is diverse in terms of size and history. The process of catch-up is also not uniform in terms of its start or speed, yet their overwhelming importance in the developing world is clear. And this group is not significantly different in the grouping of late industrializing countries, which began in an impressive catch-up with the West during the second half of the 20th century, what my close late friend Alice Hampston described as the rest. And we differ slightly on the composition of this, but the story is the same. The overwhelming importance of the 12 countries I mentioned in the developing world is striking. And I have now for my forthcoming book much more work, but I'm presenting just a snapshot view. Between 1970 and 2005, the share of these 12 countries in total GDP of the developing world increased from 62 to 70%, although the share in total population of the developing world decreased from 66 to 60%. Over the same period, their share in total exports from the developing world more than doubled, from 33 to 73%. Their share in total imports of the developing world rose from 41 to 75%. Their share in foreign exchange reserves held by the developing world from 40 to 75%. Between 1980 and 2005, and this is striking, the share of these 12 countries in manufacturing value added in the developing world rose from 70 to 85%, and their share in manufactured exports rose from 78% to 88%. During the same period, their share in the stock and flows of foreign direct investment was dominant. In effect, therefore, much of the catch-up in industrialization and development is concentrated in 12, at most 16 countries, where economic growth has been associated with structural change in the composition of output and employment, even if it did not lead to an improvement in the living conditions of most people in these countries. Now, the obvious determinants of such concentration are size, growth, and history. In terms of size, the selected countries, except Hong Kong and Singapore, city-states, and Malaysia, which is small, all the other countries are large in population, area, and income as compared with most countries in the developing world. In the sphere of growth, all the Asian countries in this group experience high rates of growth, even if the step-up in growth rates started at different points in time. For Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, or Malaysia, Thailand, and then China and India, as compared with most countries in the developing world. In the realm of history, about half these countries, in particular China and India, but also Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa, have always been dominant in their respective regions of the developing world and would have been significant in the wider context of the world economy at every stage. Therefore, it is essential to recognize that this concentration is not new. It is another matter that Brazil and Mexico were success stories before 1980, while China and India were success stories after 1980. But it is worth noting that the Asian countries in the group, which had created the requisite initial conditions, did also capture the benefits from the process of globalization during the last quarter of the 20th century in much the same way as a few latecomers to industrialization, in particular the United States, captured the benefits from the process of globalization during the last quarter of the 19th century. In contrast, Argentina benefited from the process of globalization in the period 1870 to 1914, while Brazil and Mexico were the success stories of import substitution-based state-led industrialization during the period from 1950 to 1980. In either case, unlike Asia, Latin America, with the possible exception of Chile, did not quite benefit from the process of globalization between 1980 and 2000, largely the lost decade, but this situation began to change in the 2000s. The growth performance of the developing world during the second half of the 20th century was impressive in the aggregate, particularly as compared with the preceding 80 years, but it was uneven across countries and regions. Such uneven development had three manifestations. First, there was a widening of the gap between countries in the world. Second, there was an exclusion of countries or region within countries from the process of development. Third, there was an exclusion of people associated with the persistence of widespread poverty in a world with pockets of prosperity. Now, the period from 1950 to 2010 witnessed a widening of the gap in income, not only between rich and poor countries, but also between countries in the developing world. Now, this international inequality in terms of Thiel coefficient type statistical analysis was attributable largely to the widening gap between rich countries and poor countries, the industrialized and developing. Even so, international inequality between countries in the developing world was significant. What is more, it registered a discernible increase during the second half of the 20th century. Such divergence, which is new, is associated with the exclusion of countries as also regions within countries from the process of development. The least developed countries provide a most striking illustration. The number of LDCs doubled from 24 in the early 70s to 48 in the early 2000s. In 2010, the share of the least developed countries in world output was less than 1%, but with more than 800 million people, they accounted for 12% of world population. In nominal terms, the per capita GDP in LDCs was 1/5 that in developing countries and 1/50th that in industrialized countries. Economic development simply did not create social opportunities for most people in the least developed countries. There is a similar exclusion of regions within countries from the process of development. This is not altogether new, but markets and liberalization tend to widen regional disparities because there's a cumulative causation which creates market-driven virtuous circles or vicious circles. Regions that are better endowed with natural resources, physical infrastructure, educated or skilled labor experience a rapid growth. Like magnets, they attract resources and people from elsewhere. In contrast, disadvantaged regions tend to lag behind and become even more disadvantaged. Over time, the gap widens through such cumulative causation. This has happened in most countries that have experienced rapid growth. In Brazil, you know better than I, regional inequalities between the north and the south, in particular Sao Paulo, increased significantly during the period of rapid growth. The economic disparities between coastal China and in the east and the hinterland in the west are much greater than ever before. In Indonesia, the gap between Java and the other islands is much wider. In India, the regions in the west and the south that already had a distinct economic lead have left regions in the east and north further behind. The exclusion of people from the process of development is a part of the same story. The incidence of poverty in the developing world circa 1950 we know was high. There was a modest reduction in the proportion below the poverty line in most developing countries during the period from 1950 to 1980, but this reduction was nowhere near enough to diminish, let alone eradicate poverty. And the period since then has witnessed a change for the worse rather than for better in some parts of the developing world. Now, it would serve little purpose to enter into a discussion of the poverty debate here, but it is clear that more than 1/5 and perhaps 2/5 of the world's people live in absolute poverty, and this proportion is 1/4 and 1/2 if you look at the population of the developing world. And it depends on where the poverty line is drawn. And people between the two poverty lines are vulnerable, even if they are above the critical minimum one. Now, these poor people live mostly in the developing world and constitute a significant proportion of its population. And this poverty, please note, has persisted at high levels during a period that has witnessed a sharp increase in the share of developing countries in world income. It would seem that the beginnings of catch-up with the industrialized world are concentrated in just a few countries of the developing world. There is convergence for a few, but divergence for the many. But that is not all. The benefits of rapid growth have been distributed in an unequal manner, not only across space, but also among people. There are islands of prosperity or in an ocean of poverty. The essential problem is that economic growth has not been transformed into meaningful development, which improves the living conditions or well-being of ordinary people. Of course, there are a few countries where rapid growth has led to human development and social progress. But there are a large number of countries where growth has not quite led to development, and there are a significant number of countries that have experienced neither growth nor development. It is also important to remember in all this hoopla about growth that per capita incomes are just arithmetic means, while social indicators are also statistical averages, and neither captures the well-being of the poor. In fact, measures of poverty ranging from simple to complex highlight the reality that absolute deprivation, even if it has diminished over time, persists and is widespread. In that domain, we have miles to go. I have exhausted exactly 60 minutes. If you will allow me 5 minutes more to conclude. In conclusion, it is possible to speculate or hypothesize about the future prospect of developing countries in the world economy. Growth matters, I must stress, because it's cumulative. However, statistical projections based on an extrapolation of the recent past into the distant future, which Goldman Sachs have made fashionable, even if these are the fashions of our times, cannot predict outcomes. Such projections highlight the power of compound growth rates. But growth is not simply about arithmetic. In fact, it is about more than economics. And there is nothing automatic about growth. There are underlying factors which suggest a strong potential for growth, but there are also real constraints on future growth. In the ultimate analysis, the constraints can be overcome in a sustainable manner only if economic growth is transformed into meaningful development so that it improves the well-being of people. If this happens, I will argue that it would reinforce the process of growth and development through a cumulative causation. That's a virtuous circle. If this does not happen, developing countries will find catch-up difficult and will continue to lag behind the industrialized world. The economic determinants of potential growth in the developing world are a source of good news. And in principle, developing countries may be able to attain or sustain high rates of economic growth for some time to come for 4 reasons. First, their population size is large, which is a possible source of growth, and their income levels are low, which means that the possibilities of growth are greater. Second, their demographic characteristics, in particular the high proportion of young people in the population, which would mean an increase in the size of their workforce for some time to come, are conducive to growth, provided that developing countries spread education to create capabilities amongst these people. Third, in most developing countries, wages are significantly lower than in the world outside, which is an important source of competitiveness in manufacturing activities, while there are large reservoirs of surplus labor, which would mean that relatively low wages will continue to be a source of competitiveness for some time to come. Fourth, the potential for productivity increase at the earlier stages of development, we know both from theory and history, at the extensive margin is great, from almost zero productivity in agriculture to some positive, even if low productivity in manufacturing or services, followed by a transfer of such labor from low productivity employment in somewhat higher productivity employment at the intensive margin in manufacturing. In practice, developing countries may not be able to realize this potential for growth because of constraints that may differ across space or surface over time. It is obvious that there are specific constraints in different countries, whether leaders or laggards. There are also general constraints common to most developing countries, such as poor infrastructure, underdeveloped institutions, inadequate education, unstable politics, and just bad governance. In addition, there are possible constraints that may not be discernible so far, but may arise from the process of growth, such as economic exclusion, social conflict, environmental stress, and climate change. And there are some constraints that may be exogenous to developing countries, such as worsening terms of trade, restricted market access for exports, inadequate sources of external finance, or, as now, the crisis in the world economy. Now, in the pursuit of development, I believe that poverty eradication, employment creation, and inclusive growth are an imperative. For one, these are constitutive as the essential objectives of development. For another, these are instrumental as the primary means of bringing about development. This is the only sustainable way forward for developing countries, because it would enable them to mobilize their most abundant resource, people, for the purpose of development. There is, of course, a complexity in the process of development, yet some initial conditions and essential foundations are almost obvious. The spread of education in society is an imperative, for it provides the essential foundations of development in countries that are latecomers to industrialization. Similarly, the development of an infrastructure, both physical and social, is an essential part of initial conditions that must be created in the earlier stages of industrialization. Most important, perhaps, there's a critical role for the state in terms of policies, institutions, and governance. Developing countries must endeavor to combine economic growth with human development and social transformation. This requires a creative interaction between the state and the market, beyond the predominance of the market model in the process of development, and their past could then be a pointer to their future. Thank you.